Hi everyone, Danny here from the Community Broadcasting Association of Australia. Thank you so much for joining us for today's session, Podcasting Essentials. Before we get started, today's session is being broadcast to you live from Gadigal land. And as such, we pay respects to the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, paying respects to elders past, present and emerging. Today's session, Podcasting Essentials. Podcasting continues to be a buzzword in 2020, not so much as COVID-19 or other words, but audiences are increasingly turning to downloadable content that interests them, that they can listen to in their own time. We as community broadcasters are fully equipped to utilise podcasts. We've got the studios there, we've got the time, the tools and the talent to create podcasts. They can also be used for your regular on-air content, or you might sort of want to be using them for take your podcast content, put it on air, take your on-air content, make a podcast out of it. Today's session will be presented by Tony Rasmussen, who's the Radio Senior Lecturer at the Australian Film, Television and Radio School, AFTRS.edu.au, to find out more about all of the stuff that they're doing. Courses running all the time, and Tony will be able to fill you in a bit more on that. As for what we'll be covering in today's session, we're going to look at what to ask yourself about podcasting before you begin. We're going to look at what gear you will need to make your podcast. And look at the importance of the audience. Who is it that you're speaking to? Who are you making your podcast for? Why audio fundamentals are essential. And this will, of course, be valuable for all aspects of your broadcasting, podcasting and otherwise. Once you've made it, how can you ensure that people are hearing it? And how to promote your podcast and grow your audience online. Now, that's enough of me. I'm going to turn my camera off. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Tony, that's open for you to start sharing your screen if you'd like to, sir.
I will, Danny. Just let me get onto my screen that I want to share, which is this guy here. Welcome everybody, and thanks for joining in today. It's great to see a lot of people online keen to learn about podcasting. And yeah, just to acknowledge the Camaragal people. The land I'm on is Camaragal land, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging as well. And yeah, I hope you're going to enjoy the session today. We're going to have a bit of a run through the basics, the essentials of podcasting. To get you started. And so I'll just share my screen, and as Danny's already mentioned there, these are some of the things we're going to cover today. But before we get to that, I just wanted to share with you a little funny video that came out on this ABC TV show called At Home Alone Together. I don't know whether you've been watching that at all. It's on Wednesday or Thursday nights, I think. It's about being at home in lockdown and stuck, and they ran a very important community service announcement. Just a warning, if you're a bit sensitive, this does have some strong language in it at the end, but yeah, you might want to mute if you're not happy with that, but otherwise it's a message to all Australians.
These are unprecedented times.
We know things are hard right now.
You're stuck inside with nothing to do.
You might be going out of your mind.
Just wanting to do something.
Anything.
But now, more than ever.
More than ever.
More than ever.
It's time to think about how your choices affect others.
So please, please,
Please.
don't start a podcast.
Just don't do it.
Don't do it.
You might feel like it's a productive use of your time right now.
You've probably already got a USB mic and a spare room ready to go.
And your mate Dave's got some interesting opinions.
But we're here to tell you.
He doesn't.
He really doesn't.
He's a fuckwit.
We don't need your true crime exclusive, which is just you reading Wikipedia articles to your housemate.
We don't need your minute-by-minute breakdown of every episode of Parks and Rec.
What are you going to do? Send everyone in your contact list a MailChimp newsletter?
And force them to mark you as spam instead of unsubscribing?
Because they're scared to hurt your feelings?
We're in the middle of a pandemic!
Look, it's pretty straightforward.
Just don't start a podcast.
Make some pasta from scratch like everyone else and just shut up.
The greatest gift you can give your fellow human beings right now?
Right now.
Right now.
Is to shut the fuck up.
Shut the fuck up.
Come on.
Do it.
Don't start a podcast.
Okay, so look, that's a bit of fun.
These are
Bit harsh, but also something that's very true and something to think through very carefully before you do start a podcast. There is a million of them out there, and we'll talk a little bit about that shortly, but you don't want to just pile on with something that's going to be below par. You want to think about it very carefully. Think about why you're doing it. Who is it going to be for? Why am I making this? And what's in it for my audience? Not just, as they said, you know, you and your mate sitting around gas bagging about something, but you want to, if you're going to do it, you want to stand out a bit, to be professional, and you want to give it 100%. So make it the very best that it can be, and really ask yourself about the audience. If you're going to make something, someone is going to listen to it, and who is that audience? And what are you going to bring them? What reasons are you going to bring to them to keep listening to you, to keep downloading and listening to you? So let's examine that a little bit, the importance of the audience. So, as I said, really think about who's going to be listening. If you can, build up a little bit of a persona of your typical listener or listeners, and think about the demographic that they are in. Think about the things they're interested in, who they are. And then when you've got a picture in your mind, and some people actually write out the persona and attach photos to it of who their typical listener might be. And they pass through any content decisions that they make about their podcast, or you can apply this to your radio programs as well. Always pass them through that filter of, is my typical listener going to be interested in this? Is it relevant? Is it going to mean something to them? Is it going to keep them listening? And is it going to be engaging? So once you've done that, you don't waver. You keep your podcast focused on that audience. And most podcasts are actually about gathering communities of interest. So because of that, they can actually go fairly niche market. They can be about quite specific things. And if people are interested in a particular thing, they will go looking around the web for content, whatever that might be it, history, science, books and writing, cooking, whatever it is, they will hunt it out because they're interested in it. And they might just find your podcast if you're doing something on the subject they're interested in. And they'll do that because they want to find out more, and they want to feel part of a community that is, and part of the dialogue that is out there around that particular topic of interest they've got. So you've got opportunity to do that with podcasts. And the community, you guys in community radio are very well placed to do this because you know your community so well. And by your nature, the nature of the broadcasting you guys are doing, you're already tapping into a lot of key areas of interest to your communities. So podcasting is a great adjunct potentially for you. So podcasts, they're really much about making connections with your audience. And it's interesting to think about podcasting. They're very much a one-on-one proposition. This is mostly because, and the research really supports this, the majority of people, it's been found, listen to podcasts with their earbuds or earphones. And because of that, it's usually a very solitary pursuit. So you, with a podcast, you're generally speaking with them right inside their heads. Whereas with radio, your radio show, they might have it on in the kitchen. They might listen to it while they're driving. They'll have family around them. They'll be having conversations and talking while the show's on, etc. And it's usually a device with a speaker for radio, but with podcasts, it's different. It's very personal, very intimate pastime, podcast listening. So the other thing about this is most likely you're going to have their full attention for the duration of the podcast, which is another thing to consider. So because of that, you also need to make it very special, and you can make it very personalized and speak to people in a very much a one-on-one voice. So use the words you and I, and don't talk about, you guys out there or hello to everybody, because if I'm listening in my earbuds, it's personal for me. So talk to me as an individual person, really important. Okay, so I wanted to say something about being realistic about your podcast idea here. Because a lot of people get an idea for a show that they think might have legs, but they really need to ask themselves, is it a viable and ongoing idea? Does it have the ability to sustain itself over many episodes? Ask yourself, would this maybe be better as a radio series or a limited season? Or perhaps it's just a one-off, longer form documentary idea that you've got. So try and think long form. You can be quite clear maybe about the first 1 or 2 episodes, but what will episode 10 sound like? What will episode 30 sound like? In other words, does your idea have the legs to be ongoing? Is it a viable proposition? Now, that's not to say that a podcast can't be a short series, just we start off and we know it's a limited series and has a limited lifespan. That's fine too, but that's something you need to think about at the start rather than, I'm just going to start this podcast and just see how it goes. Have a plan. Say, well, actually this one, I can see this one really being 10 set episodes and that's the end of it. Or I can say, yeah, I can see this one. Each week we will get together and we'll do a podcast and we'll put it out there and we'll engage with our audiences. And this is going to work over a long period of time. So try and plan that out. Think about that before you launch in. And yeah, this idea of sustainability, think about it from your perspective as well, not just the audiences. Think about, do you have the time to put in the energy and the dedication that it'll take to keep it going? Are you prepared to make the episodes? Say if it's a weekly podcast, are you going to be prepared to put one out every week? And then are you prepared to do all the things that will go along with supporting that podcast, promoting it, and growing it and building your audience for it? So 2 sides there. Think about the podcast itself, the idea, does it have legs? Is it a really good idea for a podcast, or is it maybe better suited to a one-off radio show or a longer form doco? And then think about you personally as well. So let's look at some of the different genres and types of podcasts that are out there. And look, this is really quite a limited sort of list because the scope of what is out there is huge. So I've just got down here things like art and culture, industry, design, science and technology, news and politics, really, really big. I just looked up the other day a list of popular podcasts, and on the top 10 in Australia are quite a number of news podcasts. Sport is very popular. Sound and music. Music, people love their music and like talking about their favourite bands and types of music. This one's quite interesting. I'm quite interested in the Beatles, so I listen to quite a few Beatle podcasts that are out there. Learn more about the band. And 2 guys in the United States. This is an example of how you can go quite niche if you want to. They decided they were going to do a podcast series about every album and song that Paul McCartney had released as a solo artist. And they started from when he broke up with the Beatles. They started with the first album that came out, I think it was called McCartney in 1970, and they worked their way through right up to the present day, week by week with a podcast. So that's an idea of that gives you an idea of how niche you can go. Also, I guess that's an example of a podcast that can have a set end time as well, because once they got up to his most recent album, the podcast stopped, and it actually has stopped. But I guess they can occasionally add to it as he releases new things. True crime is really, really big, very, very popular. And you heard them parodying that a little bit in the ABC, but it's true. People love true crime. I think true crime, I saw some research on why true crime is so popular, and it's because so much today never gets resolved. There's lots of issues out there and things that people are worried about, and it doesn't seem to ever be an ending to it. But true crime, usually someone gets caught and punished for what they do. So that's partly, this person was putting forward this proposition. That's why true crime is really popular. Quite interesting. Yeah, and Danny mentioned rebroadcasting or catch-up podcasts. So taking your show that you do either daily or weekly or whatever you do for your radio show, and just providing a catch-up service to people who are interested in it can really, really work well. Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about that. Comedy is big. Narrative podcasts are really taking off in 2020. This is around sort of storytelling, both true stories and fiction, getting very, very popular. Comedy is big. Branded podcasts. Now, branded podcasts are companies and organizations getting involved in putting out podcasts about what they do, but also some of the branded podcasts are actually not necessarily associated with the brand, but the brand will support it if it's of good quality and of wide interest as a supporter, and they'll put the money behind an interesting idea for a podcast, and so that they're associated with that. So those are getting really, really popular. The list is endless in a way. I think I saw some figures from some research that was done earlier this year. There are 850,000 active podcasts out there. And of those 850,000 that are active, there are 30 million podcast episodes to listen to. And that's from Podcast Insights in 2020. So there's a lot of topics and areas of interest, and people gathering around in communities around stuff that they like and stuff that they enjoy together. So let's have a listen to some genre examples. I'm going to try and play some here for you. I hope this works. I've just picked a couple that I'm aware of that are, you know, really well known, really good. First one is one that is very, very successful for the ABC. It's Conversations with Richard Viola. This is an example of a radio broadcast catch-up service, I guess, that's taken off as a podcast idea in its own right. So this goes to air live, or not live, or sometimes it's live actually. Richard does do live interviews, live or pre-recorded on both Radio National and local ABC. And at the moment, it has over 2 million downloads per month. When I was working at the ABC, I worked with Richard, and at that stage, probably about 5 years ago, his podcast was creeping up towards 1 million listeners. We were getting up 970,000 a month, and then he hit the magic million. He told me the other day when I saw him that he's actually doing around 2 million a month now. So let's have a listen to a typical example of that.
That weird groaning and knocking sound that you're hearing is coming from within a gigantic glacier. A glacier that sits on top of a volcano in the southeast of Iceland. These sounds were captured by Chris Watson. Chris is a sound recordist. He travels out into wild places all over the globe. Chris worked with David Attenborough for more than 20 years, recording the sounds of creatures and the places that they live in. Cheetahs, vultures, ants and caterpillars. So we can hear these animals up close and live in their world just for a moment. And when you really listen to these secret worlds, they reveal all kinds of things to you, and they take you right out of your day-to-day life. Chris Watson now brings these rich soundscapes to movies, to music projects, to art galleries, and even a children's hospital. Hello, Chris, and welcome to you.
Hello, Richard. Good to be here.
How did you record that? How did you actually record the sound of a glacier knocking like that?
It's recorded not with conventional microphones, but with something called a hydrophone, which is an underwater microphone. And I was working on it was actually a travel film project many years ago now, and we went up on snowmobiles to the summit of the Vatnajökull Glacier, and we stayed overnight in a mountain rescue hut at Kverkfell. So we were with some scientists, and the morning, it was in June, and it had snowed a little bit the night before, and I remember walking out with this glaciologist, this scientist, and he bent down and picked up some fresh snow and squeezed it in his hands, and sort of crushed it into ice and dropped it. And he said, the ice that's forming today here will start a journey down the Vatnajökull Glacier. And he said, we're going down to where the glacier calves to the coast this afternoon. He said, it might take us 90 minutes to drive down there. He said, that piece of ice is going to make the same journey, but it's going to take 10,000 years.
So you can hear there, it's an interview podcast, I'd call that. And throughout that interview, Richard wove lots and lots of wonderful recordings this guy had made around the world of nature and amazing sounds. One I like is called 99% Invisible. This is a highly produced podcast about design and architecture mostly, I guess, and the objects we use every day but we kind of take for granted. Just play a little bit of that. It's got to load. It's loading.
This is 99% Invisible. I'm Roman Mars. Picture with me, if you will, India during British colonial rule. Let's say around the year 1865. Picture a government office in Bombay, as the city was then known. Two British officers are discussing an uprising that has been challenging Britain's sovereignty over the subcontinent. It's May, the hottest month in India. Temperatures have soared to over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The officers are sweating. There's no air conditioning, of course, but they have a servant who brings them 2 ice-cold drinks. The officers take sips of their drinks and swirl the ice in their glasses. And at this moment, these cold drinks, dripping with condensation, feel like a small miracle to these colonialist wankers.
But actually, the ice was a kind of miracle.
That's our own little miracle, Sam Greenspan.
Because in 1865, no one had refrigerators. It wouldn't be for another half century until they started appearing in the US, let alone India. Think about the ice in those officers' glasses. If you were to zoom out from those glasses, and out, and then zoom in on the United States, on Boston, on a frozen lake in the dead of winter, there, you'd find men working.
So, you get the idea there. This is a podcast around really rich sound, narrative, and exploring the history of ice. I mean, turning everyday, potentially boring subjects into interesting things. So that's one to watch out for. Another one I really like is this one here called Wild Black Women. It's hosted by Dr. Chelsea Bond and Angela Hurley up in Brisbane. They work for 98.9 FM. This is a program, rebroadcast style program. And yeah, have a listen and we'll talk about it.
Look out, you're listening to Let's Talk on 98.9 FM. Chelsea Bond and Angelina Hurley have a yarn and a laugh about what makes a mob wild this week.
Well, what are you? Are you an Aboriginal or not an Aboriginal?
I'll identify this time as black fella.
It's Wild Black Women on Let's Talk. And here they are. Chelsea Bond and Angelina Hurley.
Hey.
Hey, good morning.
Good morning.
Oh,
here they are.
Yes.
Here they are.
Awake, surprisingly.
Yes,
Yeah.
just. It's been a week. It's been a week.
As we're getting it together. We're getting it together.
Mm-hmm.
Before we start, let's acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're broadcasting from this morning and the surrounding, the TAs of the surrounding Brisbane area and wherever everyone's listening into. Welcome to the show.
Welcome. Oh, how you been this week?
Oh, tired. Over it.
So over it.
Roller coaster. It's been a roller coaster.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. Check out a cliche, but yeah.
Yeah.
It's true.
Yeah. It's been a week. There's so much happened this week. And so many black people have been asked an opinion about black people things. Without actually wanting to know the answer.
That's right. That's the thing. Yeah.
No, I just don't even know where to start this week.
Where do you start?
I just because I didn't
start?
Well, I hadn't prepared for today. But I love the email that you sent me. Some stuff to yarn about Friday with the heading. I like the bold, just to bring my attention to it.
Just in case.
White woman misbehaving during Black Lives Matter.
And there's a list.
I'm not in the right mood at this point of time.
So you can hear there that it's about topical issues in Indigenous news, and it's really honest and incisive. And if you want to get an insight into what's happening, these ladies are really well worth having a listen to each week. And the things that make them wild. But the thing is, they also have a great sense of fun. So they're able to laugh, even though you could hear, that's from last week's show. They're actually quite world weary over some of the events that are happening in the world at the moment around Black Lives Matter and, Indigenous issues in this country. But they get up every week and they have a go and they try and tell the truth from their perspective about what's going on. It's really interesting, well worth having listened to. The other one I wanted to play was This American Life. Now, a lot of people will know this one, but you may not know that they actually won a Pulitzer Prize, the first Pulitzer Prize ever awarded to a podcast. So I'll let the host, Ira Glass, just tell you a little bit about that, and we'll just hear a little snippet of the first bit of the winning episode.
Hey there, Glass here. So last week, our program, This American Life, won a Pulitzer Prize. It was the very first Pulitzer ever awarded to a radio show or a podcast or audio journalism of any kind. Among broadcasters, this was always kind of a sore point. I have to say that the highest award in journalism, the Pulitzer, was off limits to us. They would not consider us at all for any awards. In fact, a whole other award, the Peabody Award, was started in 1940 as a prize for broadcasters. And one of the reasons that it was that broadcasters wanted their own version of the Pulitzer. So needless to say, everybody here was very excited to get the award, very excited to be the very first broadcasters to do this. And today we're going to replay the episode that won. It first ran this past November about things happening at the Mexican border. And what we're going to do is we're going to play the original episode. I'm going to jump in here and there with updates, but mostly you're going to hear what we originally broadcast. Just FYI, the stuff that we describe happening at the border is pretty much all still happening today, even with COVID-19. And what else do I want to say? The little boy that we start the show with, we have a big update on him at the end of the show. He is not at the border anymore, and we talked to him about it this week. Anyway, I'm saying too much. Here's the show. Darwin's 9, and he's a kid who, I don't know, people just give him stuff. When he met my coworker, Aviva, he was playing with a soccer ball somebody gave him, eating a taco somebody else gave him. And Darwin's mom was explaining all this.
Can you just describe what just happened?
I have no idea, she says.
A man, as you were talking about that people just give him things, walked by and gave you, how much did he give you? Yes. Wow.
10 pesos. 10 pesos.
¿Y por qué te dio eso?
Why did he give you that? Hey there.
Oops, lost my cursor. But that gives you an idea of This American Life. They do a wide range of stories done by reporters. People go out and about and get sounds from outside the studio and bring them back in and produce them up. That one they won the Pulitzer for. They had 2 journalists go down to the US-Mexican border and spend some time, and actually came up with some fantastic stories, including some audio of people who kidnap some of the people trying to make it across Mexico, and who try to extort money from their relatives who've made it into the United States. That actually audio of the conversation, phone conversation from the kidnappers to their relatives. So yeah, that's really worth having a listen to for a sort of structured and usually highly produced show. I'm going to zoom through here a little bit because we're getting short on time, but Reply All is a really interesting one to listen to if you're interested in the internet, and 2 guys have a conversation around stuff that's happening on the internet, interesting stuff, and then they often investigate and help solve people's issues as they come up on the internet. People who've been hacked and things like that, and they try and track down hackers and sort out issues. Unravel, that's a series on the ABC. It's kind of a true crime series, and the series I'd recommend you have a listen to is called Snowball. It's a story of someone, a US citizen who extorted money from the family of this New Zealand guy who goes and tracks down this person in the United States. Gertie's Law, that's an example of a branded podcast. It's a bit of an unusual one. The Supreme Court in Victoria actually paid for a podcast to be made about the activities of the court. And they gave these 2 guys permission to come in and be like flies on the wall inside the courtrooms, inside the judges' chambers, inside lawyers' offices. And they pieced together this amazing multi-part podcast about the activities of how the court works from all angles. Really great stuff. And the final one there is called It Burns. That's an example of paid for podcasting. Yes, people will fork out money to pay for good quality podcasts. It's an audible.com podcast made by Mark Fennell, and he made a podcast about the hottest chilies in the world and how they, the skullduggery that goes around trying to get the name the hottest chili. And Mark's a guy who's based in Sydney, and he travelled around the world basically to track down some of the growers of the hottest chilies in the world and some of the mysterious things that happen around the world of chilies and eating the hottest chilies. So it's really engaging. The other good thing about podcasts is that they're not time specific. So this means you can, you can put them out pretty much when you please, although there's some caveats around that, and we'll talk about that a bit later. But you don't have to stick to a set duration. If your podcast is going for like 20 minutes, then if the 20 minutes has done the topic, then wrap it up. If it's got 30 minutes in it, well, you can actually do 30 minutes. So you're not locked into like your schedule that you might have at your station where you have to fill a half hour or an hour or 2 hours. Your podcast can be what it needs to be. And, you can release it. You want to release it on a semi-regular basis, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but you're not tied to, being on air at 11 a.m. every Thursday morning. You have to have a podcast ready. You've got a bit more leeway and frees you up to, to make episodes as long as they need to be. And also frees you up because it's pre-recorded. It frees you up to polish it up a bit. And this is where you start thinking again about the audience and making your podcast and the best it can be. You've got the opportunity to do that. It's not live to air necessarily. You can actually polish it up. Really think about the use of sound and audio, music, effects, on-location recordings, if you can get them, to spark up interest in your listener. Don't have to overdo it, but generally you can be a little bit more adventurous with podcasts and podcast topic than you might be with your radio show. It also means that if your podcast is a rebroadcast of your show, you can value add. So you might want to offer some exclusive content alongside your rebroadcast of your show. So for instance, if you might be like, if you like that interview that we had with Grace about successfully growing azaleas, then we actually spoke to her for 15 minutes. We only had time to bring 5 minutes in our show, but if you want to hear the full interview, then it's available now on our podcast page, and you send people to your podcast and you build that community of interest. People will feel like by being associated with you and your show and your podcast, that they're getting something, they're getting access to more of what they're really interested in, something that brings them exclusive content or content they normally wouldn't get access to. It's kind of like feeling of being in a club and being part of it all. So let's get on to talking about what sort of gear you will need if you want to start a podcast. Okay, so you guys are pretty lucky because you're way ahead of a lot of people with no skills or access to equipment. You already are into radio and you've got access, as Danny said at the start, you've got access to mics and studios. But if you need to get out and about and record, or if you're going to record and edit from home, you'll need a few basics. So the first thing to talk about here is headphones. These don't need to be expensive. You can even get away with earbuds if that's all you have, but it's really important to listen when you're recording to how it's sounding, and also how your talent sounds. So how you sound and how your talent sounds. Does it sound clear? Is the mic popping? If I'm outside, is there wind noise getting into the mic? If I'm in a room away from the studio, does the room sound boomy or echoey? By listening while you're recording, you'll save yourself a hell of a lot of heartache when you get back to the studio or get back home to edit if you're listening on headphones. And by the way, that kid, he isn't using headphones, and also that microphone he's using isn't actually plugged into anything, as you can see. But it's a cool photo. A lot of people use it, so I wanted to put it in there. Okay, just a bit more on headphones. If you're going for a decent set of headphones, try to get some that actually cover your ears, over ears headphones, and because this will help block out noise from outside, and you'll be able to get a much better idea of what's going on in the recording. As you can see there, that's a pair of Akg headphones. They're pretty well recognized in the industry as being a good brand. They range in price from about $80 or $90 up to a couple hundred. That model there's actually, I saw it on eBay for $90. So other brands are Sennheiser, Audio-Technica, Sony are good brands, and you'll see them in studios around Australia. There's lots of different models out there and lots of different price points, but get yourself a set of headphones. If you're going to be out and about recording, good idea to get yourself a digital recorder, a portable recorder. Now, at a pinch, you can use your smartphone. They can do a reasonable job. But if you're serious, you'll probably want to get one of these. At AFTRS, we issue all our students at the start of the year with a Zoom recorder like this one. They're Zoom H4Ns. It's got a built-in access for stereo microphones. It's got built-in mics up the top, but down the bottom there you can see some XLR jacks that you can plug in other mics. You can use it by itself and sit it between you and, say, a guest and record pretty well. Or you can plug in two mics or one mic if you want to get better sound. It can also act as a USB interface for your computer. So if you don't have a USB mic, you can also record and play directly into your computer with this device as well. So pretty handy. That brings us to microphones. Really good you need a workhorse that is kind of tough and will take a bit of punishment if you're going to be taking it home or out and about. This one's not too expensive. It's Shure PGA 58. It's really cheap, probably about 75 to 80 bucks. If you wanted to go up the line in the Shure mics, you'd probably go up to a Shure SM58. It's very highly regarded, especially if you're out and about, maybe traveling. It's built like a tank and can take a bit more punishment. There are other really good mics out there from brands like Audio-Technica, Behringer, AKG, Rode make really good mics. They're an Australian company, Electro Voice. And these types of microphones are called Xlr mics. And this is a type, just because of the type of cable that plugs into them, and you'll need to plug into a recorder with. They're not USB mics. But if you're recording at home, you're doing your podcast a lot at home and you're recording directly into your computer, you might want to get yourself a USB mic. A lot of podcasters use USB mics. I've actually been doing a bit of research into this recently because with the COVID-19 virus, we've been working a lot from home and doing a lot of Zooms like this and using USB mic, but also our students have been using remote studio technology to record their programs. And a lot of them have been using USB mics to do that. So one of the cheapest that I've found, and that's getting really good reviews, is this little one, the Rode Inti USB Mini. It's $149. It's got a great sound and it can be portable as well because it's very small. Rode, as I said before, is an Australian company too, so that's a good thing. Its big brother is the Rode NT USB. It's quite a bit bigger and it is more expensive, but it comes with a few more features. Both these can actually sit in front of you on a desktop with a supplied small little stand, and they can be mounted on boom mics as well. So that can work really well. And of course, if you have that Zoom H4n recorder and a separate XLR mic, then you don't really necessarily need a separate USB mic, but these could be handy for some people. Also, you're going to need editing software. So the good news out there is that there's, if you're on a budget, there's a good suite called Audacity, which you're probably aware of. A good place to start. But if you're getting more established, you might want to step up to Adobe Audition. That's going to cost you usually a monthly fee of about $30 for the license. But for the people who are really interested in getting into professional editing and who want to get into a technology that's used in commercial and ABC radio stations around the country, you probably want to get into Pro Tools. That is getting expensive though, probably about $900 to buy outright. But there are a range of plans you can use to pay per month or per year. I think they start around about $450 a year for a subscription to use Pro Tools. At AFTRS, we teach Pro Tools because it is used in industry so widely, and we also teach Adobe Audition as well. But a lot of the principles around these editors very similar between Audacity, Pro Tools, and Adobe Audition. They just have more and more features added on. So, interesting part around once you've made your podcast, how do actually people get to hear it? So you've made it and it's sitting on your computer as an MP3. You can probably upload that to your station website for people to listen to as a podcast, but that'll only get to those people who already know about your website, your station website, and will come and find it there. How does that little MP3 of yours then make its way out into the big wide world and be available to much more of an audience amongst all those millions of others that are out there? How can they get access to it on their computer, get access to it on a mobile phone, or get access to it on a smart speaker? Well, for that, you're going to need what's called a podcast host, and I've listed a couple of the popular ones there. These are companies that are set up to store and distribute your podcast. So they have the ability to make them available around the web and on all sorts of different devices. And there are lots of different companies out there. These are just a few. We use at AFTRS, we use Acast as our podcast host for AFTRS Radio. And you'll have to do some research to find out the one that best suits you. Each one has slightly different services and benefits and different monthly charges. But some, you'll find, will actually, to get you started, will offer a free podcast hosting, and they'll have fairly basic but usable services. So if you might want to start there. If you want more capabilities, usually the fees start around $10 to $15 a month and go up to about $30 a month for an individual. It might get you things like, they actually build customizable players that will sit automatically and then embed themselves into things like Facebook or Twitter, for instance. But, you can get started for free here if you want to. If you want to get on to, if you get onto even the free services, that'll distribute your content around the world to every podcast app out there. And for that, you'll also get a basic web page that you can host your podcast on, and you can build that up and populate it with other interesting stuff for your audience, and tell your listeners about your podcast. And you'll get some analytics back from the company as well. It'll tell you actually how many downloads you're getting, where those downloads are coming from, what sort of devices people are using to listen to your podcast, etc. And this is really, really handy information. There's a difference between knowing, I got so many downloads, but actually knowing that 120 people downloaded your podcast. It was on a Saturday morning. They were using an Apple iOS device, and that 100 of them actually live in Melbourne is really, really useful information for you about your audience. You start to get a bit more of a picture of who they are. So these podcast hosts will give you analytical information back about how people are using your podcast. That's really, really helpful. Also, some of these companies, the podcast hosts, will run ads maybe at the beginning or before your podcast starts, or at the end, so it doesn't interrupt your podcast. But some of them will actually offer to pay you a little cut of the advertising revenue they make. So from some of these companies, you might actually be able to make some money. Now, they use what's called a podcast RSS feed to get your information about your podcast out there. So what is that? It's a special page of detailed code that probably you and I can't write, and they can write, that's compiled by your podcast host. And they write it, and they take on the task of distributing your work using this RSS feed to all the podcast apps that are out there. And they do this on your behalf. And that's how your podcast will end up on things like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Pocket Casts, Amazon, Alexa. This is just a few. They'll do more than that. The RSS feed has all the info it needs to tell these different podcast apps that aggregate content out there, things like the name of your podcast, what it's about, cover art, durations of episodes, etc. So once that RSS feed is discovered by these podcast apps out there, they'll keep coming back regularly to check if you've uploaded anything new, and then they'll add it to the list of what they've got, of what you're making available. So this is why you need a podcast host. Really, really important. Okay, just going to wrap up here with a quick whip through of publicizing your podcast. So remember we talked about potential audiences for your podcast earlier, and understanding as much about who they are and making sure why and what you're making for them is focused and relevant. This comes in here as well. Publicizing your podcast is really important to bear that in mind as well. And thinking about reaching your audience to tell them about your podcast, you need to keep this in mind. First up, you need a really good podcast description. Not too long, short paragraph at the most. And make sure it's got keywords about the topic or subject, especially if it is on a specific topic. You need a pithy one-sentence tagline for your podcast too. This needs to hook people who will be browsing the web and looking for those communities of interest on podcast apps and on the internet, who are looking for content like the content that you are making. So if you've got a one-sentence descriptor that they can easily get a handle on, you'll be ahead. Be useful, and that one-sentence descriptor will be handy all over the place for social media, etc. You can use both that descriptor and taglines in various places when you're publicizing your podcast. So remember, we said, you'll get a podcast website with your podcast host. Well, you'll need that to look as good as it can be as well. And you can use your description, your tagline. You can put in lots of other information in there. And when you're putting that up there on the web, make sure that you use categories and tags, and use hashtags when you're using social media that always mention the topic, and will spread your message further by people who search using hashtags, search using tags, and you'll get into search engine hierarchies and algorithms so that your stuff starts to pop up when people are searching. Create a social media accounts for your podcast, and again, get your message out there in every way that you can. The other thing is to post on social media and post on your website regularly. Be consistent. I've got that there as a point there. Be consistent with delivering your podcast and delivering support for your podcast. If it's a weekly show, then deliver it weekly. If it's a fortnightly show, make sure you do it fortnightly. Don't leave it a month before you put up another podcast episode. That doesn't mean you have to do it at exactly the same time each week, but if your audience is expecting it to be there, then it should be there on the day, roughly around a day that you say it's going to be. Don't forget that also that a lot of podcasts are discovered by word of mouth. So people talk about what they're listening to and recommend to each other. So if you're making a topic about a podcast about a specific topic, get involved with that topic elsewhere. So if you're making a podcast about something you're probably interested as well, join in Facebook talk chats about the topic, other blog posts about the topic, and make comments on Twitter and stuff like that. And then people will get to know you and potentially your podcast. And as I said, the apps have algorithms built into them too. So they'll be looking for things like popular downloads, ratings and reviews. Sometimes they'll have star ratings for podcasts. Try and get as many people as you can to rate your podcast and give it a good review. And it'll climb up the lists of recommended podcasts. And finally, with publicizing your podcast and getting a podcast started generally, be patient, because it takes time to build an audience, and it takes time to get the word out there about your podcast so that the audience comes in and enjoys it. I think I'll probably wrap there, and I'll maybe take a few questions. I think I've got time, Danny, for a couple of questions.
We do indeed have time for a few questions. Tony, thank you so much for that. That was absolutely fantastic. A lot of questions coming through in regards to music usage in podcasts, so we'll get to those last, if that's all right.
Yep.
Great question here from David via Facebook. He said, how regularly should we podcast? Are the podcasts more likely to get traction once they're sort of coming on a monthly or weekly basis?
David, I think that is probably pretty much tied to what your podcast is about. And, if it's quite an intense podcast that takes a lot of time to get ready and you want it to be really, really highly produced, setting yourself a sustainable time frame is really, really important for you. It's kind of that balance we talked about earlier in the morning, about how much you can put into it each week or 2 weeks or month, and also what your audience expectation might be around that. I would think you'd probably try, especially when you're starting off, to try and make it weekly or fortnightly if you can, and then you can maybe, after it gets itself established and it's it is taking you more time, you can maybe slip it a bit, but probably weekly or fortnightly. And build that audience. And because of that, it might be good before you release the first one is to get yourself a little stock of shows that are already ready to go, to give you a bit of leeway once you do start, so that you're not on that grindstone of churning them out on that regular basis right from the get-go. You've got a few in the can already, and that'll help you get yourself established.
Good stuff. A really interesting question here from Cecilia Lim about podcasts in languages other than English. Is the podcast format something that's got traction in other languages like Hindi, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and so forth? Is that something you're aware of, Tony?
Yeah, I'm kind of aware of it. We do a bit of work. We've got quite close connection with SBS, and they are definitely proving that there are audiences out there for podcast in language. And these, again, are really, really strong communities of interest. So that you can tap into a particular language group, then, yeah, you've got a really potentially big audience there who are also hungry for really good content.
Excellent. So I just want to jump in quickly. So a quick question Tanya asked. Her radio show is of a certain name. Should she call her podcast the same name? I might respond to this one quickly. From a copyright point of view, that would be something where I imagine that would be fine to do that. The copyright on the title of programs is one of those things that really depends on sort of like a presenter's agreement and what sort of the setup is at your station. But I would imagine that if you're creating this in conjunction with your station, they would be more than happy for the program to have the same name as your radio, or for your podcast to have the same name as your radio program. You got any thoughts on that one, Tony?
Look, if it's building on an audience that you've already got and it's about the same topic or theme, I think it makes a lot of sense to make your podcast have the same name, provided, and it is also recognised as a station activity, and perhaps it's something that would live on both the station website as an added extra, a podcast associated with your show that you're doing for your station. And, there's no reason why it can't also have its own separate podcast page as well. And I think the two can really self-promote each other. I think that could be a really good idea, provided that works, with the manager of your station to do that.
A question here in regards to the scheduling your podcasts so they'd be in seasons, very much like a TV program, I guess. So you sort of do a bunch of podcasts as one season, then you move on to the next season.
Yeah, that's a good idea. And quite a few of the podcasts that I listen to, they do have seasons. And provided you flag that with your listeners and they know that's the deal, because you don't want to stop doing them at the end of the season and then they all go away and you have to start from scratch again. Make sure that you flag really clearly that, we're going to be back for season 2 and in such and such in 3 months. We'll be back with another whole block of brand new podcasts for you. You've got to just make sure you make that clear from the start, and that it can be successful to have seasons, and it also paces them out really well for you as well across the year.
Excellent. Now, so the connection between what your proposed podcast might be and your existing radio program, that's obviously something you've got to work out yourself. Presumably, if you're using the station hardware and infrastructure for producing the podcast, they might sort of want a bit of content out of that one. So you might be interested in some of the further reading that I've just placed into the chat box there. The CBAA webinar from approximately 12 months ago, making a podcast from your program or a program from your podcast. Another similar one to that, CBAA webinar on air to online. If you're loving the Facebook videos on the CBAA Facebook, you might want to check out one from the 2018 CBAA conference, amplifying your community's voice through podcast. And of course, the CBAA is distributing what is essentially a podcast to all of our members at the moment. It's called From the Embers, taking a look at the effect that the bushfires earlier this year had on their communities. We talk to community radio stations all around the nation. So that is podcasting content that is also fantastic to be able to be used on your radio program. I am just going to steal the screen for a second, if that's all right with you, Tony. Can I get you to relinquish the screen, one such as me?
Just got to get my... Oh, I just wanted to get in that little plug for the AFTRS virtual postgraduate info day. Danny, is that okay? Before we...
Oh, of course, please do.
This is next Monday. From 5:30 p.m. You can catch a live discussion with Fiona Smith, head of radio. You get a rundown of all the radio courses we offer and get to meet some current students and recent graduates who'll hang around for a virtual chat and answer all your questions there. And you get a virtual tour of our studios and facilities in Moore Park. So Andrea and Danny will have that link there to register for that event. I've put it down the bottom there. And we'll be sharing this slide pack with you as well. So I'll just stop sharing. But yeah, that should be fun next Monday evening, 5:30 p.m. There you go, Danny.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. And also the information there in regards to what Tony was talking about then, we are going to be sending that out to everyone as part of the post-webinar correspondence. That's the AFTRS website there now that we're looking at, aftrs.edu.au, if you want to check that one out. I just wanted to, because so many questions have come through in regards to the music usage on your podcasts.
Yeah.
That could be a webinar in and of itself because it is a big, big thing. On the assumption that you are producing your podcast on behalf of your station and that your station will be sort of using their website and on-air facilities to promote the podcast and host the podcast, if you will, you would need to ensure that they have the correct licenses from both APRA and PPCA. And these are add-on licenses to your existing licenses. For APRA AMCOS, it's called the Other Online Use. I'll send a link to this document in the follow-up material. It is affordable, and if podcasts are something that the station is taking on, would very much recommend investigating it. Other online use is what that's called. PPCA, it's sort of referred to as a digital license for broadcasters, and includes a license for catch-up or podcasting. That's sort of under the webcasting section of their website. If you want to find out more, business.affairs@ppca.com.au. But I do note that we've had a lot of questions come through about music usage there.
Really make sure your station has the rights to do something like putting music into commercial, especially commercial music into podcasts, because if you don't have those licenses sorted out, you can get yourself into a lot of trouble because it's going to cost you a lot of money if you use commercial music without those licenses. Basically, because it's going out as an MP3, artists see that as publishing their creative content, and this is fair enough, in a downloadable form, and they don't like that. And so if you don't have a license to do it, you won't be able to include music that's commercial. You can use short snippets for review purposes, but yeah, that's all you can do unless you've got a license to do it.
Excellent. All right. Thanks very much for that. Another quick question here. Would a podcast increase your credibility and place you as an expert in that area?
Look, I think I was going to say something about this at the end. You know, radio is still a very, very viable medium and still very popular and has a bright future. But we are in a time when people are looking for content that they can download and listen to in their own time and on devices that they want to use. And so I think it does add to your credibility by giving them that option alongside your live radio show to also be there out on the web and just value adding to what you do. so that you're giving that audience another way to listen to your content. If they can't tune in, they can't see. People are really time poor, and appointment listening with radio shows is getting increasingly more difficult. If you can give them an option to download content from you at a time when they want to listen to it, then I think that just adds to your credibility and your connection with your audience. So I think it's a good thing.
And what about a quick one here? But what about joining a podcasting network for independent podcasts, ones that aren't necessarily beholden to the station? Although we could, of course, encourage that you do it with your station.
Yeah, that can really work for you. There are a number of networks out there that promote and distribute independent podcast work as well. So yeah, that's really well.
Excellent. I've just got the virtual post-grad info week webpage up there on the screen at the moment. We'll be sending that link along with links to the recording for today's sessions, further reading in regards to podcasts, and of course, all that information about the relevant music licenses that you would need for your podcast. I feel like the podcasting, we've only really tip of the iceberg today, Tony.
I know it's a big topic. And it's hard to cram a lot in. I'll send Danny the slides. I'll also send the links to those podcasts that I featured, and also I'll send a link to a page of some useful royalty-free music that you can use in podcasts.
Oh, excellent.
You won't have to pay for.
That's fantastic. Tony, while I got you here, I was thinking, do you want to do a podcast with me about doing a podcast?
Yeah, it's probably a viable thing to put out there. I'll tell you, you could do a series at least.
I'm trying not to think about it too much. It gets a bit inception-y, I think. Thank you so much for joining us here today. That's been absolutely fantastic. We'll be following up with everyone with all of the materials for today's session. Be sure to go and check out the AFTRS Virtual Postgraduate Information Week 2020. And indeed, check out all the stuff on their website, aftrs.edu.au. Tony, thank you so much for your time. It's really very much appreciated.
Thanks for having me, Danny. It's great to talk to you guys. And yeah, I really enjoyed coming to the conference last year. I thought it was fantastic. Unfortunately, we may not be able to do it in the same way this year, but hope to be able to get together again somehow later in the year.
I certainly hope so. And on that point, my final point today before I close down will be CBAA awards are open now, but they're closing in a couple of weeks. So be sure to get involved. Just go to the CBAA website, cbaa.org.au, follow the links to the 2020 awards. If you have any questions on how to engage with our awards platform, you can give us a call here, 0293102999, or email us, office@cbaa.org.au. I'm Danny Shively on behalf of Tony, the Australian Film, Television and Radio School, and my wonderful colleagues here at the CBAA, most notably Andrea David, who gives me a reason for coming to work every day. Thank you so much for joining us. CBAA webinars, we'll be seeing you all again very, very soon. Bye now.
See you guys.